Tom Wood came to Little Rock in 1979 to put Magic 105 radio on the air, and that station stayed on the air for 30 years, gaining a reputation of one of the most successful stations ever in Little Rock. If you're from this area, you didn't need to have me say that because you knew it. But after Magic 105 ended, Tom stayed with iHeartRadio for another 9 years on different stations before leaving to help begin the Arkansas Rocks Radio Network, a group of 12 stations around the state and online. His work with nonprofits in Central Arkansas is one of his proudest achievements and continues today with a lot of projects. And his wife of 45 years, Wendy, which explains the name that you see over his picture, is a tutor for students with learning disabilities, and they have 2 sons and 2 grandsons. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Rayanne. I appreciate being asked to do this. It's such a fun subject, and I got all excited when the Play It Loud, the History of Barton Coliseum concerts opened up at the old State House Museum, and all the preparation for it getting opened up, that when this came along, I thought, oh my gosh, this fun just continues. It never ends. So I was thrilled to be asked to do it. I want to thank the Arkansas State House Society for hosting this get together. And like Rayanne and Carrie said, the name of our conversation tonight is Perspectives in History, Rock and Roll in Little Rock. And having been here for 45 years almost, my perspective on it is kind of twofold. One is a fan, which I've always been a fan of music and concerts. There was a time in my life where I didn't spend my money on anything except albums and concert tickets. And there's actually still a lot of truth to that today. But the other perspective, of course, is from the radio business, and you see kind of the business side of it. You see kind of the fan side of the love of rock and roll from, both perspectives. And it's been fun for me. I'll tell you, one of the most fun things for me over all the years was the hundreds and hundreds of people that we've taken backstage at big Barton Coliseum concerts, and just seeing the reaction of a fan when they meet their musical idol. It totally runs the gamut. I've never had anybody actually faint when they met somebody, but I've seen them swoon pretty bad. And then there's everything in the whole spectrum. So I've gotten to enjoy both of those perspectives. And another thing that I hope we'll talk about tonight, as a matter of fact, I had a question emailed to me during my afternoon show on Arkansas Rocks that I plan to ask Joe, and it has to do with clubs instead of big coliseums, because we had Juanitas, and we had SOBs, and we had Joe's Big Bamboo. I'm sure some of you remember Joe's Big Bamboo. They played a real role in rock and roll in Little Rock. We're really, really happy to have a representative of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame here with us tonight. On my screen, he's in the little square right next to me. His name's Joe Butler. He's the manager of education programs at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And what that means is he and his team present programs to K through 12 students in an educational sense. And they kind of connect the classroom lesson to the power of rock and roll. And I got to tell you, when I read that, Joe, I thought immediately of Jack Black and the School of Rock. That's what I think your job is being the real life guy. They do those programs on site at the Hall of Fame, and they do it online too at the Rock Hall EDU educational resource platform. Joe's got a BA in middle childhood education, concentrations on math and science from The Ohio State University. He's been with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for about 5 years. Before that, he was a Science Center employee, demonstrating all the wonders of science to people. He's a musician too. He's a drummer. He jams with friends. He's just like all of us, dives in all the record bins, trying to find treasures, trying to find breakout bands and musicians at clubs around where he lives. And he's just totally into music. And that's why he's got a pretty great job. Being at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is just a way to bring all that passion in a real personal, meaningful way. And we're lucky to have you here, Joe. Everybody, welcome Joe Butler from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Well, thank you, Tom. Yeah, it's great to be joining everybody. And excuse me, it's great to also have learned so much about the really the history of music in Little Rock. I'll be honest, from my perspective, being a Northeastern Ohio kid, born and raised in the Midwest my whole life, and only really moving to Columbus to go to college and work down there for a few years. It's really interesting to get to learn so much about what similarities there are between all of our different, larger metropolitan areas of the United States, but then also what makes them so different, especially when you look back on the history. And certainly the history of the Deep South, the Delta South, is so much a part of the story of rock and roll. And we'll get into a little of that tonight. But yeah, without further ado, I think I'm going to go ahead and share my screen then, and we'll get kind of right into it. And don't really need to share that. All right. Thumbs up if everybody can see my screen. Excellent. Yeah. So yeah, again, my name is Joe Butler. I am the manager of education programs at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You see it pictured there behind the great logo for this brand new exhibit, Play It Loud, Concerts at Barton Coliseum. I wish I had the time, though. With 18 months of a run time, I might get myself down to Little Rock to check it out. I see some cool guitars and concert posters down there. I'm sure it's really slick. My big goal for just our presentation tonight is to really connect the story of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, rock and roll as a music and as a movement and as a culture, to the stories that are going to be told in that Play It Loud exhibit. So we're going to connect to some of our inductees. I kind of handpicked a few of my favorites and things that really relate to the story and history of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So with that, how Cleveland built the Rock Hall is kind of where I want to start. That's often one of the most common questions we'll get is, why is it in Cleveland? And a lot of people will say, why not Memphis? Why not LA? Why not, New York City? Why not New Orleans, another huge music town, Nashville? And the reason is a few things. First and foremost, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a concept does begin in New York City, because it was founded by the two guys you see pictured here, Jan Wenner, the founder and longtime editor-in-chief of Rolling Stone magazine, and Ahmet Ertegun, one of the founders and longtime CEOs of Atlantic Records, both huge mainstays in the music culture and obviously production culture in New York City. And they come together in 1983 to form the foundation. And they start thinking, okay, we got to build a museum though, because we got to have some place to honor all these great rock and rollers that we want to induct. And so, yeah, it was New York at first, but quickly thereafter, even though they had already had a few induction ceremonies in New York, starting in 1986 with the induction of like Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley, among many others. You can go to our website and see all those great classes throughout the years. There were some folks that started making a case for other locations, and specifically though Cleveland, to be the location of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And the biggest reason for that, the biggest evidence that was levied towards the foundation, was that of Alan Freed, the DJ, being the Moondog here in Cleveland, Ohio. So I know we've got Tom Wood here, radio royalty in his own right. But we certainly here at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame look to Alan Freed as really somebody really special, because he had an awareness of specifically teenage fandom in America in the late 1940s that no one was really giving any credit to at the time. So you can kind of see here, he starts on AM radio, back on WAKR out of Akron, which is my hometown, though he himself is from Western Pennsylvania. But he then moves to WJW, 850 AM. And the significance there was that he was leaving a pretty solid gig at WAKR playing the Pops in the midday hours. And as Tom knows, when you switch stations, you rarely probably get, especially when you're a young buck, you rarely get the key time slots. So he actually ends up in the overnight slot. And somewhat out of like cheekiness, he starts calling himself the Moondog because he's up all night howling at the moon. And so that begins the Moondog House broadcast in 1951. The programming, though, again, because you're in the late night slot, all the bosses are asleep. So he kind of started to get away with playing some music that, honestly, a white DJ in a largely white market and on a station that was, again, marketing towards white audiences was not expected to play at the time. Blues, rhythm and blues, jazz. You can see it here on this advertisement poster for the Moondog Show. And the reason he was playing that was because he was really good friends with a local record shop owner, the record store here, Record Rendezvous, which you see a picture here. The building still stands. It is currently vacant here in Cleveland, though Cleveland going through a bit of a resurgence here. We hope that this sort of iconic and very important building gets preserved somehow or occupied by somebody who really understands the history of it. But you actually see the owner there, Leo Mintz, pictured right out in front in that white shirt there. And Leo Mintz and Alan Freed get together, and Leo is telling Alan some interesting stories. He says, you know, the darndest thing, I got all these white suburban teenagers that come downtown from the nearby neighborhoods. Cleveland Heights, actually, where I live, is another near East Side neighborhood where a lot of these kids were coming from. He says they pack in my store, they grab every rhythm and blues record that they can handle, they take it back to the playing booths, they drop the needle, they dance, they holler, they have a great time, and then they leave and they don't buy the record. Because to bring that record home would bring a world of chaos, anger, and frustration, and who knows what else from their parents, because those were race music records as they were marketed at the time, because they were Black artists making Black music for Black audiences, as far as many of the record companies and promoters were concerned. So Alan gets it in his head, though, well, if you got all these kids listening to this music but then not buying it, why don't we take the music to them? Because if there's one thing we do know about the power of radio, is you can't segregate it. The airwaves are open, and it transversed that racial barrier and that color barrier, and it got those kids the access to the music that they were wanting. So they're turning on their transistor radios under their pillows late at night, tuning into the Moondog. But it didn't take very long for that to change. It went from being an underground secret thing to being big time Billboard extravaganzas. And again, that's because of people and pioneers like Leo Mintz and Alan Freed, who say, well, you know, everybody's listening. Let's get a show together. And so they coordinate and launch the Moondog Coronation Ball, widely accepted as the first rock and roll concert here at the Cleveland Auditorium on March 21st, 1952. And another partner of theirs who was a concert promoter, Leo Platts, actually another Leo, he accidentally kind of misprinted the tickets. They basically sold out the show so fast. They said, let's make more tickets, get more people in. And they ended up printing double the tickets, but they didn't put dates on them. So what happened was everybody had a ticket, showed up, and they blew the doors off of the arena. And basically by the time you got to, I think, the third act or whatever, the police were there. They were shutting it down because they had closed the doors. People were trying to bust in through the doors. And you can see down here in this picture here, this is basically the one photo from that Moondog Coronation Ball. And as you can see, it is just a flurry of activity and a sea of humanity, because at the end of the day, this was a dance. That's what the first rock and roll concerts were. They were all about dances, getting the kids in, moving, grooving, hopping and bopping. And you can see here, again, in this photo from a different Alan Freed rock show, because this was one of many that then came throughout the rest of the 1950s. It is a integrated, diverse crowd because this music found its way into everybody's ears and made everybody's feet move. And it brought people together, as we know it still does today in so many ways. So that's really the core as to how the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ends up in Cleveland, because we showed from the city's support and lots of other DJs and artists that said, God, this is the place where rock and roll began, because you had people like Alan Freed saying, this music isn't just for one group of people, it's for everybody. And so that's really what we see. So now to connect us to, though, Little Rock, Arkansas, let's take a look at the Barton Coliseum. And Rayanne did a great job of getting me a list of like all these great concerts and amazing acts that traveled through that area at the, throughout its existence. And there was one thing though that was really interesting to me, and it was this showcase that happened on April 21st, 1961. And what's very interesting to me here is you have right at the top 4 inducted acts to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We have Fats Domino showing up there in that show. The Shirelles, a great girl vocal group. The Drifters, an iconic male vocal group. And widely accepted as one of the architects of rock and roll, Bo Diddley. You see him pictured here with his iconic rectangular guitar. One of those rectangular guitars we have on display regularly at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because it really shows that for a lot of these early blues guitar musicians, they had to be creative in how they were able to access their instruments and their music. The reason that Bo Diddley has these rectangle guitars is that one of his first guitars, he had to build himself. He was able to get all the guts and electronics and things in the neck, but the body was hard to come by. So he actually just took boxes and made a guitar body out of wood boxes, and that's where he gets that look. Now, of course, once you do that and you become famous and you start selling records, you can convince a guitar company to make you a rectangular guitar. So he had many, many more of those in his collection throughout time. But as you go on down the list, though, there's still great names here. I mean, we've got Chubby Checker and Benny King. You'll notice the asterisk there with Benny King, because Benny King was actually inducted as a member of the Drifters. So you have him right here at Barton as he's going on to his a little ways into his solo career, but still showing up to the show with his bandmates, his former performance mates. So again, showcasing that rock and roll is a community. So a lot of times you have all these great collaborations we see throughout the years because these artists look to each other as familiar within the sound and within the music. And then we have lots of other folks like Chuck Jackson, the Shells. But most interestingly to me was this Paul Williams and his Show of Stars Orchestra that was at this show in Barton, at Barton in 1961. But if you notice, if we pull back up the Moondog Coronation Balls poster, right there, one of the top billings is Paul Williams and his Hucklebuckers. So Paul Williams, if you don't know, a really incredible saxophonist, band leader, musical arranger. And here we see him representing 2 of his different acts. In the case of the 1952 Moondog Coronation Ball, he's with his Hucklebuckers. And by the time he shows up in Barton, it's his Show of Stars. But besides just showing up on all these great showcase bills, he also was a session musician, a band leader, a consistent backing musician for acts at Atlantic Records, which we mentioned earlier with Ahmet Ertegun, and notably was the backing leader for inductees like Ruth Brown, as well as James Brown later in his career. He was Paul Williams was no longer with Atlantic at that time, but that just shows you that when you look back on Barton's history, going back to even the 1960s, the earliest 1960s, it's showing that they recognize that connection to this huge swell of interest and fandom that was going to be coming with rock and roll in the coming decades, right? So, you know, it's kind of widely accepted that rock and roll as a style of music begins getting recognized in the mid-1950s. Some people will say that's because of the song Rocket 88 by Fats Dominoes. Others will say it's no, it was Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets. But certainly when we start to hit the late 50s and early 60s, we're seeing that second wave of rock and roll stars hitting. But here is Barton Coliseum showcasing those architects of rock and roll and doo-wop groups that had that crossover success like the Drifters, and then honoring again those big hit makers like Chubby Checker and the Shirelles. So I want to get us back then to Cleveland for just a moment and back to radio. since we've got Tom here with us, to give you a little bit more history about Cleveland radio. So we talked about how Alan Freed made his big debut on AM radio. FM radio played a big role in Cleveland as well, with one station in particular called WMMS. It begins broadcasting in 1948 as a sister station to another big AM station, as many FM stations did back at the time. But by 1968, it starts going by WMMS, based on it getting bought out by some big Uber company. But quickly around that time, they adopted the progressive rock format. So playing a lot of these progressive rock albums, like from Yes and Rush and the Moody Blues, and really these long form albums that were seeing great success in a lot of other radio markets around the country on the FM frequencies, where DJs would just take and put an album on. K-San, most notably out of San Francisco, was one of the real pioneers of that long form progressive rock format. And Cleveland's WMMS adopts that. It's this format, though, and this radio station that provides some of the first big U.S. radio breakouts for inductees like Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, David Bowie, and Rush, which I know many folks down there saw the several times that they played at Barton. We'll talk about in a moment. And if you're wondering, the guy there dressed all in the sharp suit, that's a buzzard. And so this radio station earned its nickname of the Buzzard because it really hits its stride in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where Cleveland, being a Rust Belt city, was suffering a lot of the downturn from changes in the steel and automotive industries. But yet something that Cleveland likes to pride itself on is its resilience. And so it kind of started earning that name of like, yeah, we're dead, but we're not gone. And we'll be back, much like buzzards kind of show that, even in death there is life, right? And that it still is called that today. We still see the buzzard adorning all kinds of t-shirts and things like that around town. But yeah, so I was talking about Rush, and Rush is really special to Cleveland because, as I said, it was the first really radio breakout for that band at WMMS. A DJ by the name of Donna Halper started playing them in regular rotation. She much like I think the joke always goes for like Freebird on the radio, she would play a lot of their songs. Specifically, Working Man was one of the ones that got the most play in Cleveland because it was so long. It would give them time to take breaks, hit the restroom, grab a drink, whatever else DJs in the 1970s did. Tom's laughing good. So that's how, though, and it resonated with the Cleveland audience because of it being a predominantly blue collar town with all the factories, steel mills. We are a port city, right? So we have an active international port where we have lots of Great Lakes and interoceanic ships that come through. So a lot of hard working folks here in Cleveland and working through harsh winters. We were talking about weather earlier today. And so it really resonated with folks and it earned Rush a big following in Cleveland. But then that following in the United States broadened them much further. And as you know, they played 6 shows in Barton Coliseum in 11 years there between 1977 and 1988. And I know too, even in my research here for tonight, I saw lots of great ticket stubs and stories being shared on Google and various sites and news pieces about the exhibit there at the old Arkansas State House. So I'm excited that you all get to, remember that history of Rush. And I hope now you kind of just have a little bit extra perspective on how Rush really ends up in the United States as a band, because obviously starting in Canada, they had lots of great performances there, but they finally break in through Cleveland, since luckily we're not too far away. We're just a lake away. Another band, though, I wanted to talk about, and really the last band I want to get into tonight so we can get to questions and other people sharing great stories, is the band Heart, who I know also had a lot of great success playing at Barton. Again, 6 shows around this. I'm sorry, I didn't change my years there. I believe the years were a little bit later. Is that correct? They were probably coming more through the 80s into the 90s. Even maybe most recently the 2000s. Is that right?
Yeah, and Ann Wilson came to the State Fair just a few years ago.
Excellent. Well, and I really mention them because these women, and as you can see, they're bandmates who were inducted with them as part of the band Heart back in 2013, which was the same year as Rush. So if you're looking for great induction years to see cool footage and cool performances, the year of 2013 is a really stellar one with bands like Heart and Rush right there for you to check out. But yeah, Ann Wilson, Nancy Wilson, this two-headed female juggernaut of hard rock and folk inspired power really just shook up the world. And as you can see here, they had 8 multi-platinum albums and 7 top 10 albums in the United States. So they are far and away one of the most successful commercial bands in the history of rock and roll, let alone being female led. They really do rock the house. And we actually have great relationships with both of them. Nancy Wilson, in fact, was on site when the Rock Hall opened its Play It Loud exhibit a few years ago. We had one called Play It Loud, the Instruments of Rock and Roll, where we showcased all of these iconic instruments from everybody from Prince to Bo Diddley to Chuck Berry, pianos from Jerry Lee Lewis, and just amazing things. And so we actually had Nancy join us for that. Though most recently, as of just last weekend, we had Ann Wilson here in Cleveland singing the national anthem to kick off the 2021 NFL draft. She's done the national anthem at many other events and I think some playoff games and things like that with the NFL. So it was just a really natural fit, though, once it was here in Cleveland to have this great inductee of ours join us to honor America in that way. So this is just another way that you can see that that history and that connection that you have for yourselves down there in Little Rock to this rock and roll music and all the great memories you have there. We share so much of that here in Cleveland. And in fact, that's why I love working for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because it takes something that I literally grew up with in my backyard. My parents in 1995 went to the concert for the Rock Hall. So that's another video if you can catch it on YouTube or find it on Blu-ray of it, where you have these unbelievable one-of-a-kind performances. My parents were there. So it's always been part of my life, this deep connection and honoring of this music history. But for you folks there, it feels kind of great to have that connection with all of you of all the great times you got to share seeing all these great acts. And honestly, don't take it for granted, because even if you look today at all these new tours and things that are spinning back up post-COVID, there's a lot of cities that get skipped, and a lot of cities you go, gosh, how could you just not play there? So for Barton Coliseum to be this location that everybody hit and everybody stopped at from all different kinds of corners of popular and rock music, that's a real privilege. And I'm really honored to just have been having a chance here to come and share my knowledge and history of it with you all. And I look forward to answering some questions or hearing some stories about all those great memories everybody had at the Barton. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Joe. Awesome. We like to lay claim to, it was interesting to hear you say the different ideas of where the first rock and roll record came from and what it might be. Is it Rock Around the Clock? Is it Rocket 88? There are many stories told around here that the first rock and roll artist was Louis Jordan, who is from Brinkley, Arkansas. And
yeah,
I think he's in the hall, isn't he?
Now, see, this is something everybody likes to do to us here at the Rock Hall and say, hey, isn't this person inducted? And honestly, I think now well over 350 individual well, actually, I should say acts. And then not to mention that every band that had, even at his heart saw there like 6 folks. I'd have to look that up myself. But what I do know about Louis Jordan, which is really spectacular, another great artist who is not inducted, but we had a great interview with from back in the 90s, was Little Milton. Another amazing blues guitarist from down there in the Deep South. And him telling the story of how he had his little Sears Roebuck transistor radio that he would tune in to the Louis Jordan show to catch, because honestly, at the time he was talking about it, the only radio program really that you would get regularly out there was the Grand Ole Opry out of Tennessee. And so he obviously listened to that a ton. He's a huge country fan, but him telling how he was able to access that great rhythm and blues, early sort of rhythm and blues, early jump blues, big band sound by tuning into that Louis Jordan show, which was only 15 minutes, he said. After you got to hold all the promotions and the ins and outs, he had to hit it just right to catch the radio waves and tune into that Louis Jordan show. So yeah, no, having Louis Jordan as like kind of one of your state neighbors is a pretty awesome connection to the history of rock and roll, no doubt.
Another thing, combining radio into the Rock and Roll Hall. For years, Paul Schaefer was the guy who would lead the band for the after induction ceremony jam session. And I heard an interview with him one time. For those people who don't know who he was, besides the Hall, he was the band leader for the David Letterman show for many years. And he's a Canadian. And I heard an interview with him one time that he said when he was a kid, and he's about my age, he used to listen to KAAY radio in Little Rock, Arkansas for Beaker Street, because Beaker Street on KAAY was being broadcast on a clear channel radio station, which means on that frequency, 1090 AM, there was no other radio station in America on that frequency after sundown. So the signal, honest to goodness, went Alaska, Norway, Peru, Africa, the whole world could pick it up. And to this day, the original host of Beaker Street, Clyde Clifford, does a show every Friday night on the Arkansas Rocks Radio Network. Same background noise, same underground approach. People just freak out when they realize they can still hear him doing that. So that whole KAAY thing is a big source of pride for us.
That's amazing. And I am looking at the chat here. Yeah, thanks. And see, that's the other thing. The second somebody asks who's inducted, the internet and everybody else always knows. But yeah, he was an early influencer, and all that is typically based on really just when a lot of their impact can be seen in later artists. So something I'll just get on real quick here for everybody to hear is we consider three criteria when inducting someone into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame: impact, influence, and innovation. And so certainly Louis Jordan checks many of those criteria off super handedly. But based on how that's relative to then many of the performers that were inducted early, especially including like a Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley and others in that early class, that's how it's all kind of relative in the storytelling. But you can, as they said, 1987, Louis Jordan was inducted as an early influence. So very early in the concept of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they honored that. Now, some of the other names, these are names I see a ton. Little Feat, Warren Zevon there. And the question, will they ever induct Little Feat or Warren Zevon in my lifetime? I'm not sure. Stay around as long as you can, and you have a chance. Those folks are more than eligible at this time. It takes 25 years past your first commercial release to become eligible for induction to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it ultimately comes down to a lot of things. It is a nominating committee that meets every year in New York. And these are folks from all different areas of the music history world, music culture world. It's authors, it's reporters, it's radio executives, it's artists themselves that meet in this room and hash it out. And in the case of like the early influences like Louis Jordan, they actually get in without even really being voted on. There's the performers category, which is how most inductees get in. And those are voting. That's where you get your name on the ballot. The ballot goes out to all living inductees, as well as many other, big wig, music, radio, television, movie people, industry folks. But we also, as the fans, get a vote. We get to go to the fan vote, which actually I believe tomorrow is the last day that the fan vote is open for the 2021 nominee class. So if you are interested in sharing your thoughts on who should be inducted in 2021 to the Rock Hall, you can go to rockhall.com/vote and do that there. And essentially, once we get that all done, and we close out that voting. We take the top 5 and basically cast them as a vote amongst the other, it's over 300. So it's a nice big chunk of folks that all collectively say, this is who of these nominees should be inducted. So there's a great website called futurerocklegends.com. They are sort of the gatekeepers of all things past, present, future Rock Hall inductions. They track everybody's nominations. They track the years that they were nominated, and then when they finally get in. So that's a great resource to use as well, and see if they've been inducted before. I know Warren Zevon in particular ends up a lot at the museum. We have one interactive that we've had for a few years now, where folks can come in and actually put in a name that they hope to have nominated. And our CEO, Greg Harris, actually takes that list every year of fan-generated recommendations for nominations. He takes that into the room for the nominating committee. So at the end of the day, I can attest that if you get in there and engage with that nomination list and you get your artist up to the top of that list, their name will walk in that room. What happens after that, again, is up to a lot of voting and a lot of cases being made by different folks about what their impact, influence, and innovation was, and how it is relative to other folks in the class. But yeah, there's always a chance. We are not in the business of not inducting folks, but it is all about the voting process that gets people in.
Carrie, I'm trying to look real casual here at reading the chat, but I'm having trouble with the small type on my computer. So maybe you can tell me if there's any good questions we could use.
Well, yeah, folks have asked about Warren Zevon and Little Feat, as to whether or not thoughts on whether they'll get into the Hall of Fame. Also, Black Oak, Arkansas. So,
Oh yeah.
And again, to the point, I know I see somebody who says they meet that criteria, and absolutely, it is just ultimately a matter of how it all shakes out, because every year there is a list of sort of unimaginable greatness that deserves induction and definitely has earned their right there through all of those means. And it ultimately comes down to telling a story too for us at the museum. Once they're inducted, we love telling their story because it's so great, as we've talked about today, finding all those amazing connections through time and history and sound, and being able to talk every year about a new person and a new group and get them connected to that story is really great and an honor for me to learn about and explore. So again, the only thing I can encourage is wait, see who gets inducted this year. We've got a lot of great nominees this year. We had 16 nominees so far this year. It was the most diverse class we've had in sound, in gender, in ethnicity, in background, in history. So as much as we can, as the Rock and Roll, Foundation, even, we're really trying to broaden that net and capture as many folks as we can. And at the end of the day, we're typically only inducting about 6 to 7 at most performers per year. Certainly, if you're able to tune in on HBO, where we typically air the induction ceremony, some folks are probably down to watch nothing but Rock Hall induction performances and things for weeks on end, as I know we were talking about with the YouTube channel. But if for anybody out there who was ever part of one of these productions at Barton Coliseum, if anybody out there was part of the roadie crew, the lighting, sound, or even a ticket taker, putting on a show for even one band, let alone, one and maybe 2 opening acts, is a huge feat of just patience and dedication. And we certainly have that with our team there. But yeah, when it comes to the induction ceremony, we're already planning it. We've been planning it since January 1st, when we didn't even have nominees. And here we are, we don't even have inductees yet, but we're already planning the show for this fall. It's a huge undertaking. My teammates that do those things are really incredible folks. So there is ultimately a practicality every year where it's like, we want to give everybody their chance on stage. We want to give everybody their moment to shine. And unlike the Oscars, we don't cut people off in their speeches. So we give a really great platform for a lot of artists to get up and share their gratitude and their reverence for being inducted. And so hearing them every year talk about how much they love the fans and appreciate the fans is always great. And I'm grateful that our induction ceremony gives them the ability to do that. And if we did induct like 30 people in one year, like some folks on our Facebook like to suggest, then that would dilute everybody's opportunity to do that. So we really do hold that opportunity in high regard because that's what they've earned. By the time you're inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you get to stand up and say what you want to your fans and to the people that got you there.
Tom and Joe, one question is, any stories about the late, great Eddie Van Halen or groups like them?
Well, I mean, we've got lots of great stories to tell. Play It Loud, as I mentioned earlier, was a great showcase of some of Eddie Van Halen's stuff right before he passed away. We were able to get that on display, and unfortunately, he was too bad off at the time to really participate the way that we know he wanted to in that. But still, the ability, I should say the humility that he had for giving us so much of his equipment. I mean, we had these huge Marshall stacks with all the big tubes in them, 2 of his early Frankenstein guitars, all his pedals and things. And something that happens a lot at the museum is folks will come in and say, well, where's all your Kiss stuff? Kiss, another great band that I know played huge shows at Barton. We just don't have any because they haven't given us any. And there's there's snippets on different channels about some members of Kiss that talk down about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but those same members have come to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and done great things with us. We had a great exhibit actually where we showcased pinball machines that were related to music and rock and roll. And if you didn't know, great trivia thing here, Kiss, their first pinball machine in like 1975, I believe, was one of like the most popular pinball machines of all time. And so we had that one, and then we had their newest one, which was created in 2013 that you might find at your local billiard hall, bowling alley, bar, rock club. And so, yeah, they were there. They showed off the pinball machines. We had Peter Criss's massive DW silver kit that I really liked being a drummer. So the fact of the matter is we have a great relationship with Kiss as well. We have a great relationship with so many of our inductees. And so to have something like those great iconic early guitars from Eddie Van Halen was a real honor. And so we're so grateful to have had that opportunity to get that stuff from him and showcase him and his artwork there, because really his guitars, like Bo Diddley's, were really a work of art, because there was a guy who wanted a sound that he had in his brain to come out of a machine that no manufacturer was making. And so he had to make it do what he wanted. And so that's something that I always find really spectacular about Eddie Van Halen, is that ingenuity that he had to create an unmatchable sound.
I'll tell you a couple of good stories about Eddie Van Halen, since they wanted to hear something specifically about him. The times that he played at Barton Coliseum with Van Halen, sometimes David Lee Roth was the lead singer, sometimes Sammy Hagar was the lead singer. And invariably, when you would take radio station winners backstage to meet the group, and this happens a lot, the big stars of the groups don't really come in. It's kind of the support guys. So for Van Halen, it was always Michael Anthony, the bass player, and Alex Van Halen, the drummer, who would come out and meet the radio station winners, and that's fine. But every now and then, if he was feeling particularly comfortable, Eddie would just kind of pop in real fast from whatever dressing room he was in, and he'd have a can of Coke, or he'd have a beer, or he'd have something he was eating, and he'd just shyly wave at everybody and say, "Hi, I hope you like the show," and then he'd dart back out. And it was just no matter how much time you got to spend with the bass player and the drummer, 5 seconds with Eddie was way more memorable than it was for the other guy. He was.
So Tom, I was just going to ask you, did you have any favorite or significant memories of any particular concerts at Barton?
I have a really, yes is the answer. And I'll tell you 2 stories. I'll tell you one where I got myself in big trouble on stage at Barton Coliseum, and I'll tell you one that I think may have been my favorite moment ever in meeting somebody who had been an idol for many years. Robert Plant came to town with his first solo album and did a show at Barton Coliseum. I don't remember the year, it would have been in the 80s sometime. And we had a very small number of people that we were going to take back and have Robert meet them and sign autographs and take pictures and stuff. And I happened to, ordinarily I'm with the people and all of my teammates, Jeff Allen, Sharp Dunaway, all the people who worked with us at Magic 105 would be chauffeuring the people into the room. Well, I just somehow ended up in the room with Robert Plant for about 5 or 10 minutes before the winners came in. And I've never been hypnotized by somebody's presence the way I was with him. He was so present and so soft-spoken and so peace and love, true embracing of the hippie lifestyle and beliefs. It just knocked me out. And I've always listened to music that he's produced after I met him in one way, and I heard it in a different way before I met him. And that I can't think of a single other artist that I was lucky enough to meet that actually happened, where meeting him or her changed the way I listened to the music. The one time I got myself in trouble, the radio station that I was working with, Magic 105, was celebrating our 10th anniversary, and we booked Bad Company and the Damn Yankees to play our 10th anniversary concert at Barton Coliseum. The Damn Yankees was made up of Jack Blades from Night Ranger, Ted Nugent, and who was one of the other members? I can't remember, but it was like a super group.
Wasn't Tommy Shaw one of those?
There you go, Tommy Shaw from Styx. Thank you, Carrie. And we were told backstage, look, when you go out and thank all these thousands of people for supporting your radio station, and the Damn Yankees are going to be up in just a couple of minutes, don't single out any one member because they're a group. I know they're all stars in their own right, but they're a group. Well, I lost my mind and I went, Ted Nugent's here tonight. And the crowd went crazy, and I got off stage, and the manager literally grabbed me by the lapel and said, what did I tell you 5 minutes ago? I don't think I was ever in that much trouble with a promoter or a manager as I was that night.
I just wanted to reach back then real quick though, because Tom, you had mentioned earlier, you had a question kind of pertaining to clubs, and I'd love to kind of touch on that actually.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, Joe. We had this come from a listener that sent it to me at the radio station. Does the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame plan to establish a category or at least some formal recognition for concert venues in America? There's big famous ones like the Fillmore, Winterland, and so on. There's other places that probably are long since closed, Cobo in Detroit, Cow Palace in San Francisco. Not to mention all the bars and the juke joints in America, CBGBs. We had our own Juanita's and the SOB and all these other great places. Does the Rock Hall have any kind of plans to do that?
Something that they did do years ago was, create a lot of landmarks. So I know different states, different cities do them in different ways. But those, bronze plaques that would immortalize a certain location, because as we know, many places, unfortunately, have met the wrong end of a wrecking ball and are, this is where that great club was. This is the, physical location on planet Earth where those great sounds were heard. But unfortunately, you can't go in there. You can't see music there anymore. So I know we did do that with a lot of places. We don't have a comprehensive list or representation of that. What we do have at the museum that I can speak to is through some great donation, we have the original, or I should say the last exterior awning for the CBGB club, the famous punk bluegrass. I mean, it was anybody and everybody could play there, but it was a big punk scene back in the 1970s and 80s in New York City. So we do have that in our main atrium. So it's one of the most popular photo opportunities at the Rock Hall to get your picture taken under the CBGB awning, where you had great acts like the Ramones and Talking Heads and Blondie and all these great new wave punk bands that really made their cuts there. My vice president, Dr. Jason Hanley of our education and fan engagement. He's a New Yorker, born and bred, and he himself was in like an electronic band back in the early 90s, and so he actually got to play there. I know, so at least one show. So we have that ability to honor those great locations, but unfortunately not too much that really I can speak to on a comprehensive scale. I do know here in the city of Cleveland, we have the location of that Cleveland Arena where that Moondog Coronation Ball happened. That has a plaque near it, though that has since become a the sort of regional Red Cross offices. And another great club near here was called Leo's Casino. And that one, unfortunately, folks kept trying to take the landmark sign as a souvenir. So unfortunately, we didn't, somebody took it and then it ended up back at the Rock Hall. So somehow somebody took it, somebody else took it from that person who took it, or just guilt came over them, and it got returned to us, and we had not put it back. But Leo's Casino, for anybody who didn't know, was really a spectacular place. It was another integrated club throughout the 1960s. And while Cleveland was predominantly a working class city, it was just filled with music fans. And one of the coolest things about Leo's Casino is it kind of became Berry Gordy's of Motown's training grounds. So there's actually a great story of one of the first times that the Supremes performed outside of Detroit was at Leo's Casino in Cleveland, because it was Berry Gordy's opinion that if you could make it at Leo's, you could make it anywhere. Because that's how discerning the club was, but also just how dedicated the club was to being fans of music. So that, and Swingos was another place. And then a place that I'm very proud to still be able to attend shows myself is called the Agora Ballroom in Cleveland, Ohio. And we talked earlier about WMMS making it in the United States for acts like Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band and David Bowie. And the Agora Ballroom is very significant to both of those folks because that was David Bowie's first U.S. performance was at the Agora Ballroom in Cleveland, Ohio. And Bruce Springsteen has an album, I believe, is Live at the Agora in 1975. That is like one of his greatest live albums of all time. And really, it was the boss at his, just at his best. And so, yeah, we definitely love to have those relationships with those iconic clubs and those special places. But honestly, we as the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame can only do so much. And it really takes a lot of grassroots efforts and local activation to really get places like that preserved. I mean, certainly for those of you that work at the old State House, you know what it takes to keep a building that occupies probably a decent amount of high-priced real estate from just becoming some other office complex, shopping center, blah, 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 to quote Alex Lifeson. I saw somebody mention that. So it really takes a local effort typically to get those kind of things done. And, certainly when the Rock Hall can help to do that, we try to, but it really takes the community saying, hey, this is a place that matters to us and our heritage. And certainly we see that represented by this great exhibit that you have there of Play It Loud, the history of concerts at Barton Coliseum, because that's your community and all of you, the fans out there, taking it upon yourselves to keep your ticket stubs, keep your records, keep your photos and memories and sharing them and archiving them in a way that will save them for generations to come. So ultimately, yeah, we try to do our best at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but as you all know, there's more great clubs where you've seen so-and-so before they were anything that many folks will just never know by name, that it's up to you to find a way to share that with the world. So blogs are great ways to do that too. Lots of great blog space out there for people to tell the awesome stories of all these iconic clubs.
Well, I know that Tom can probably speak to this a little bit better than I can, because at the moment I'm not remembering any of the specific names of the clubs, but up in the northeast part of our state, in Arkansas, there is a state designated stretch of Federal Highway 367 that's known as the Rock and Roll Highway, because along that, I guess probably for about a 50 or 60 mile stretch were a string of dive bars and juke joints and such that folks like Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins earned their chops playing at. And one of those clubs was the inspiration for the Porky's movie.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, one of those. I don't remember which one, but one of those. And at least one of those is still standing. I can't remember the name of it at the moment.
Well, when you get up into that northeast part of the state, you're not but an hour away from the legendary Crossroads too, which is written in so many blues songs that have been adapted into rock songs. And as a matter of fact, when Robert Plant was here for that, this is another funny Robert Plant story. When he was here for that solo tour, or it was when he and Jimmy Page got together again and did a solo or a tour of just the two of them, Page and Plant, he made a day trip over to Helena because he wanted to see the place where the King Biscuit Blues show took place. And there's, as you were saying earlier, Joe, where Louis Jordan had a little 15-minute radio program. Every day in the lunch hour, there's a 15-minute blues program on the radio station in Helena called King Biscuit Time. And Robert Plant walked into the studio because he was Robert Plant, he could do that. And the fellow who was on the air was an older gentleman, and he did not know who he was, but he understood that he was a musician. And he said, "Have a seat, young fellow. What do you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm a singer." And he says, "Oh, that's great. What kind of music do you sing?" And he went on to have a conversation with him for 5 minutes. Never knew he was Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin the whole time. Fantastic. So yeah, this part of the country is so rich in stories and history and myth. I love it.
Oh yeah, and I learning about Helena, Arkansas, and so much of the research I've done is really spectacular. That King Biscuit Hour is it's one of those programs that just kind of, if you know about it, you know, and yet at the same time, so much of the music that we get to appreciate for the past 3 decades, but 3 decades has so much ties to that music program in particular. I see so many of our inductees that recognize that as one of their early influences. So yeah, really special radio you got down there.
Very, very special. Well, this has been great.
I love seeing some of the first concerts. One, Ted Barnes was sharing the Byrds with Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels and Sam, the Sham, and the Pharaohs. Yeah, wow, what a lineup that was, and also, you know, shows just how great music is, that it can, we can get so many different acts into the same space, and just expose different folks, different audiences to all these different sounds. And we still see it today, luckily, with all kinds of great collaborations that you see in every style of music today.
Gosh, I should have been looking over here at the chat window. There's answers to everything. It's Sunshine, Sunny Pain that I was talking about in the King Biscuit Hour, and the Robert Plant tour that I was talking about was 1988. Yeah, you people are amazing.
Yeah. Creedence Clearwater Revival, B.B. King, and Tony Joe White. That's a bill.
Wow.
Yeah, B.B. King in the middle. When you got B.B. King in the middle of a show, that's a show.
The other day I played on my radio show the Question Mark and the Mysterians song, 96 Tears. And I did a little research about them, and they did a tour of America after that song became a hit. And it was the Strawberry Alarm Clock, Question Mark and the Mysterians, and the Electric Prunes. And I thought, man, I'd pay $100 to see that today.
Call that the Fruit Basket Tour.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh gosh.
Tina Turner and Mr. in 85, and Rick Springfield. Yeah, that's, oh wow. Yeah, the 80s were a really cool time for concerts too. And And certainly, yeah, looking at the list of Bartons, it was everybody and anybody.
What was it that you ran across, Ray Ann? 70 members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame have played-
76.
76.
76. Carrie caught some I missed.
And
I forget, there was about a 5-year stretch in the early 80s, like 81 through 86, where there were something like 36 or 37 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees that played at Barton just in that 5-year period.
Yeah.
Wow.
Some of them more than once.
Well, I had a conversation with a journalist here in town, Joe Kelly Bass, who's written about music for many years, and he's going to do an article in Arkansas Money and Politics about the Play It Loud exhibit. And he was telling me that one of the things that they make a point of in the article is how we're geographically perfectly situated to have gotten all these great shows. If you're doing a show in St. Louis, you're going to do a show in 2 nights in Dallas. Why not stay in Little Rock and do a show? Well,
yeah. Oh, yeah. Location. It is
Yeah.
the most important thing.
Yeah.
It does have a lot to do with how Cleveland gets to be the music, the birthplace of rock and roll. And again, a lot of cases were made for Memphis and Nashville or New York, all these, or even like Seattle, San Francisco, LA, all these locations where you can look at and you can say, oh my God, that sound, was rock and roll, or that was rock and roll, or those artists really made it. And that's true, right? The scene of a city is so important to its culture. But where Cleveland really stood out and continues to stand out is that it was, one of the third largest at its time cities back in the heyday, back at the turn of the century, the 20th century, that is. And, because of that, it was on the way from New York City or Washington, D.C. up to, the new big city of Chicago at the time.
yeah.
And then two, being a port city and a place that the steel and ore of Kentucky and Pittsburgh could make its way up to the Lake Erie. It just was this confluence of activity and industry and therefore population, but it came from all walks of life. Certainly lots of Black American families coming up during the Great Migration, lots of immigrant families. We've got, great neighborhoods of, Slovakian heritage, of Hungarian heritage, Irish, German, on down the line here in Northeast Ohio. So it brought, being where we were and what we did for the world and for the United States at its time, just brought all these ears and experiences together that allowed so many great artists to have great shows when they came through Cleveland. I mean, they don't say, thank you, Memphis, in the movies. They do say, thank you, Cleveland. Good night, Cleveland. It had its moments in Spinal Tap and all these other great movies that we know and love about music. But it's because of the fandom in the city. And that to me is what makes Cleveland the real home of rock and roll, because it was the fans that made rock and roll. And certainly I saw somebody else mention, what are the genres? Genre is actually a word I typically, just as myself, try to not use very often, because genre as a concept has a lot of connotations depending on who you are. And specifically, it's really defined by the record industry. And not to disparage them in any way, they got to sell records, they got to package it, they got to make sense and market it. But at the end of the day, we talk about style at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and we talk about rock and roll style. And that can be a lot of things. It can be sound, it can be attitude, it can be the overall theme. For folks that have questions about who gets inducted when, I always look to folks like Lou Reed, 2-time inductee. The Velvet Underground, you listen to the Velvet Underground and you can hear a lot of really great, iconic songs. And I mean, songs that you can just tap your foot to and have a great time. But that same guy turns and puts out Metal Machine music as Lou Reed. And he is taking a guitar and he is absolutely abusing it, smacking it, smashing it, scraping it with metal, and just making these horrific, unearthly sounds with it. But that was him expressing himself through his sound. Can everybody listen to it and say, yeah, that's music? No, maybe not. And that's because everything is up to us to be subjective about when it comes to that kind of aesthetic judgment. But, that's the thing about it. Rock and roll was never one thing, because even at its inception, with Alan Freed in particular, being this DJ that just used this otherwise euphemism that was kind of part of the rhythm and blues culture. And you can hear a lot of songs from that era that, use rock and roll to say something else. But he recognized that it represented, though, the feel that it gave you and the energy that it had, and it could keep you rocking and rolling all night long. It just had this constant momentum. And so still today, that's what we really try to encapsulate when we talk about the power of rock and roll at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, is that energy, that art, that artistry, that expression. And it ultimately can be packaged in a lot of ways by the record industry. Sometimes it's hard rock, progressive rock, hip hop, country rock, pop, everything under the sun. But at the end of the day, we just recognize rock and roll for the power, the energy, the spirit, and the artistry.
I'm having
There's a couple of people asking for specific stories from you. One about Joe Elliott of Def Leppard that you let on the radio for an hour once. There's the Styx story from their Kilroy Was Here days.
Yeah.
I'll tell you some more once you tell about that.
Joe Elliott and Def Leppard had come to town for a show at Barton Coliseum, and he came to the radio station for what he thought was going to be a quick 10-minute interview, play a song, encourage people to buy tickets. But during my conversation with him, he mentioned that he was a DJ for a little while when he was a teenager in England on his hometown radio station, and how much he loved it. And I said, well, here, have at it. You got a 50,000 watt radio station right here. And he took over for a whole hour, and we let him play anything he wanted to. We booted all the commercials out of that hour, and we just let him go. And he had so much fun. The phones were open. He was answering the phones. It was really one of the greatest artists visiting the radio station moments we ever had. And the Styx story is a great one. The Kilroy Was Here tour was being formulated by Styx Record Company and the different promoters around the country that were going to handle the different regions. And Little Rock, Arkansas was left off of the tour. We weren't going to get a show during the Kilroy Was Here tour. And Styx is a huge band, always was, always will be a huge band in the Little Rock area. So we came up with an idea at the radio station. What if we could get 10,000 people to sign a petition, 10,000 being the capacity for Barton Coliseum? What if we could get 10,000 people to sign a petition, thereby pledging they would buy a ticket? We could sell out a concert if they'd add us to the itinerary. And the record label never made a, complete, yes, absolutely, we'll do that. But they said, sure, give it a try. And it was a promotional juggernaut for the radio station. We were appearing at everything from barber shops to liquor stores to grocery stores and car lots, trying to get people to sign the petition. We got the 10,000 plus signatures. We submitted it, and I'll be darned if they didn't add us at Barton Coliseum to the itinerary. And it was the biggest feather in the radio station's hat to date.
Power of the people.
It was unbelievable. Yeah, give the people what they want. That's exactly